All right, we'll get going as people continue to log in and start with the introductions. So hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Really happy to be here today to talk about a very important topic, which is biodiversity loss. Very happy to have our guest speakers with us today. Focus of a conversation is biodiversity topic in general, setting the table, but also diving into what that means for corporates and corporate reporting entities. I'm very happy to have with us today Zaneta Sadilekova, who is founding director and CEO of the Climate Law Lab, as well as Gabriela Hermosia Goncalves, who is technical officer to the TNFD GEF, which is the Global Environment Facility Project for the UNEP-FI, and she's speaking with us today on behalf of the UNEP-FI. I will not go into the details of their backgrounds and experiences. For that, I would refer you to the registration page of this webinar, where you can find their bio notes as well, of course, as their LinkedIn profiles. I'm also joined today by my colleague, David Hagaratz, who is a senior ESG innovation analyst at Navisto. And we're going to start off with David giving us a 10 to 15 minute presentation, more like 15 minutes, I got to tell you, on setting the table for definitions on the topic of biodiversity. What are we talking about, and what are some of the major changes happening in terms of global action on biodiversity loss? And then we're going to continue with a conversation, discussion with our guests today. Happy to take questions from the audience. That is part of the reason why we have these webinars, is to give you an opportunity to ask your questions directly to the speakers. So please don't be shy. You could put your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar, and we'll be looking at those throughout and hopefully have time to answer all of them. And if we don't, we'll try to circle back to you afterwards to answer them. So without further ado, I'm turning it over to David.
Thank you, MJ, and welcome again to everyone. So before we dive in, we think it's critical to level set on some key terms to make sure we're all using a common language when discussing this topic. So firstly, nature, of course, which is a broader term that encompasses the natural world, including living organisms and their interactions among themselves and with their environment. Biodiversity is part of nature. It's a bit narrower of a term, and that focuses on the variability among living organisms from all sources. And so this includes diversity within species, for example, genetic diversity, between species, and of ecosystems. And ecosystem services means the contribution of ecosystems to the benefits that are used in economic and other human activity. And ecosystem services is really what cuts to the core of the discussion, because this is what draws the connection to an organization's nature-related impacts and dependencies. And these two words we're going to start hearing a lot more of in this context, and we'll hear a lot today, surely. So the term impacts or nature-related impacts refers to changes in the state of nature, which may result in changes to the capacity of nature to provide social and economic function. And these impacts can be positive or negative, or they can be direct, indirect, or cumulative. And finally, dependencies, which refers to aspects of ecosystem services that an organization or other actors relies on to function. There are many examples of this, including an ecosystem's ability to regulate water flow, water quality, hazards, etc. So to recap, there are three terms that have mostly been used in scientific or academic contexts. Nature, which touches on broadly living and non-living components of the natural world. Biodiversity, which is a part of nature, focusing on living organisms at their different levels of diversity. And ecosystem services, which connects these concepts to human activity. And then two terms, impacts and dependencies, that were more recently introduced in the business context to help explain how a business interacts with these things. So we also want to briefly remind ourselves of a few well-established tenets that tell us fundamentally about why we're having this discussion today, why nature and biodiversity have become such key ESG topics for companies, and why it's so important for companies to be engaged. So these mainly come from IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is made up of 130 member governments. If you're not familiar with IPBES, it in many ways can be seen as the biodiversity equivalent to the IPCC for climate change. And its first global assessment report was published in 2019 after 5 long years of work, really the first of its kind for an intergovernmental agency. It involved hundreds of experts and authors all over the world and analyzed over 15,000 scientific publications and a substantive body of Indigenous and local knowledge. So what we know from this, and from many others, of course, is that biodiversity and ecosystem functions are in severe decline globally. So with a global problem reads systemic risk, and this is happening at an alarming and accelerating rate due to human influence. We also know that our quality of life and economy depend on nature and biodiversity. Many will recall the 2020 report from the World Economic Forum and PwC that found 44 trillion, or at the time, more than half of global GDP, so more than half, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. And finally, biodiversity loss is intricately connected to climate change, but there are important differences to consider in complexity and how we address the problems and in the types of information that companies will be expected to do and disclose. So taken all together, companies themselves have a really clear role and responsibility in addressing these issues and managing the related risks and opportunities, recognizing that companies interact with nature on very large scales. On the dependency side, if there are significant dependencies in the value chain, companies will need to think about how they preserve those natural inputs and reduce the risk of business disruption. On the impact side, whether impacts are direct or indirect, with increasing stakeholder expectations, companies need to think about potential legal and reputational risks and how their biodiversity impacts might influence their social license to operate. And I'm sure our panelists will be able to expand on this even more later on. So this is really the preamble to where we've come today with corporate reporting on nature and biodiversity, and it brings us to recent developments that we'd like to briefly touch on and summarize for you now. So there's much more that we could add to this list, but with the time we have, we'll cover the Global Biodiversity Framework coming out of COP15 to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and a few of the current and upcoming disclosure standards, namely the European Sustainability Reporting Standard, the GRI 304 update, and finally, the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards and their potential plans on this topic, and then summarize how this all fits together. So starting with the Global Biodiversity Framework, this was a direct response of 196 governments to IPBES's assessment report, and the closest thing that we have to a Paris Agreement for nature and biodiversity. And many will say it's not perfect. It's hard to expect something at this scale to be, but it starts to pave a path forward for international and national level policy. So there's lots to discuss about how the goals and targets and potential national level policies aimed at supporting these goals and targets could impact companies. But in terms of corporate reporting specifically, we can see very clear direction in Target 15. And again, this is not to disregard the rest of the goals and targets, which will surely have knock-on effects on companies. But Target 15A gives very clear direction for countries to, quote, take legal, administrative, or policy measures to encourage and enable business, and in particular to ensure that large transnational companies and financial institutions regularly monitor, assess, and transparently disclose their risks, dependencies, and impacts. There's also an explicit call for large transnational companies and financial institutions to disclose this information not only for their operations, but also for their supply and value chains and portfolios. So significant calls to action for companies to increase the volume and quality of information on this topic. It's also important to note the connection to other ESG issues that come out very clearly in the framework. One being the contribution and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and another, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources. So again, very clear connections to potential material issues that companies already experience and may already be looking at, but maybe not yet through the lens of biodiversity and the role that they could play in carrying out the objectives of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So moving over to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. The TNFD is a global market-led initiative with the ultimate aim of supporting a shift in global financial flows away from nature negative outcomes and towards nature positive outcomes. So the TNFD is producing a truly leading framework, forming the foundation for companies to learn how and what to disclose. Therefore, essentially responding directly to Target 15A expressed in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the framework goes beyond the scope of just disclosures, and it covers risk management as well. And that's a key difference to the TCFD recommendations on climate-related financial disclosures. The TNFD is about assessing and managing, not just disclosing. And it does this by recommending companies to undertake an initial scoping assessment before engaging in the reporting exercise. And this is known as the LEAP approach. And this helps companies better understand their nature-related dependencies and impacts, and subsequently their related risks and opportunities so they can be managed. On the disclosure side, as was planned, the recommended disclosures in the TNFD are building off of the TCFD, not completely reinventing the wheel. So indeed, they retain the same 4 pillars, except that the risk management pillar now includes impact management as well. And it carries over all 11 TCFD recommended disclosures with a few new recommendations that adapt to the nature context. It also adds 6 general requirements that cut across the 4 pillars and apply to all recommended disclosures. So the TNFD has published and will continue to publish more additional guidance, including sector-based guidance and biome-based guidance. But overall, its core contents and recommendations are meant to be applicable to all companies, no matter their context. And this is a key piece to recognize that any company, no matter size, sector, jurisdiction, or materiality approach, can apply this framework and the recommendations. So the final version of the recommendations are coming in September 2023. And following that, the task force has said they will begin work with the standard setting organizations to translate their recommendations into voluntary standards. It seems as though some of these discussions have already begun. So this is expected to follow a very similar path as the TCFD recommendations, in the sense that the TCFD has very successfully become the bedrock and fully baked into all mainstream climate-related disclosure standards and regulations, either current or upcoming. So speaking of disclosure standards, we'll jump to those now. A few of the main ones related to nature on biodiversity, starting with the European Sustainability Reporting Standard E4. So the European Commission recently published the draft delegated act for the first set of ESRS under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Since then, there was a month-long feedback period, which is now closed, and the Commission is expected to adopt the delegated act very soon. And assuming no changes, it will then officially apply starting January 1st, 2024 for companies with financial years beginning on or after that date. And this means for many companies, those that are subject to the CSRD requirements and who determine the topic of biodiversity as material, that this standard, E4, would apply for the reporting of those companies in 2025. There are many phase-in rules, however, that could come into play depending on a company's size and context. So just like all other ESRS, there's an explicit double materiality concept. So meaning it considers impact materiality and financial materiality, so that a sustainability matter is material for a company if it meets either one or both of those types of materiality. And this entails identifying material impacts, risks, and opportunities through a materiality assessment. The standard also needs to be considered in conjunction with ESRS 1 general requirements and ESRS 2 general disclosures, as well as several other disclosure requirements from other ESRS, including those on greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, marine resources, waste, and affected communities. It's important to note that this standard does require companies to assess and disclose information beyond its own operations and through the value chain as well. It's also meant to apply to all sectors with a small asterisk there, because sector-specific standards for the ESRS are to be developed. So jumping over to the GRI 304. So GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative is one of the oldest, most widely used voluntary sustainability reporting standards out there. The GRI is currently in final stages of updating the 2016 version of the topic standard on biodiversity. This is a project that began back in late 2021, following a significant revision of the entire set of GRI standards. One of those revisions included the now explicit impact materiality approach, with a particular focus on negative impacts that a company has or could have on the economy, environment, and people, which of course applies to all topic standards in the GRI. So in a very similar way to the European standard on which GRI was providing a lot of input, the updated GRI 304 exposure draft requires information on the value chain beyond just a company's own operations, in particular on the supply chain. So in the coming months, GRI will finalize the revisions based on public comments received and publish the revised standard. And lastly, the International Sustainability Standards Board under the IFRS Foundation, which is developing voluntary disclosure standards for companies that focus on the information needs of investors specifically. So these standards are then expected to be taken up and made mandatory by jurisdictions and likely adapted to the needs of those jurisdictions. Having just released their first official set of standards in S1 and S2, the ISSB is now developing their 2-year work plan with a public consultation to decide what their research and standard setting priorities will be. And there's a potential project on biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services, or BEES, which is a rather fitting name, but still to be determined whether this potential project remains in the ISSB's agenda following the consultation. And we think that's quite likely considering everything that was just mentioned. It's also unknown what the outcomes of such a project would look like, whether it means developing a new standard, a standalone standard, updating the industry-based SASB standards, or a combination of these or other outcomes. So we do expect the ISSB to draw from the TNFD, similarly to how they drew from the TCFD for the S2 climate-related disclosure standard, recognizing the extensive work that the TNFD has already done through consultations with stakeholders across the market and through many different channels. However, in the request for information document, which it will be linked here in the slides for you later, the ISSB explicitly calls out multiple sources on which they could leverage and build upon. So including many of those that we've already mentioned, the European standard, the GRI, as well as many others, such as the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials, or PBAF, the Science Based Targets Network, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and many, many more. But their ultimate approach would be to consider all information from all of these sources through the lens of information needs of investors and come out with something that's fit for that purpose specifically. So lastly, how does this emerging reporting architecture all fit together? Thankfully, the good people at the TNFD have laid it out for us already very clearly in this figure, to which we would make some slight adjustments for completeness and accuracy, which you see now. But overall, we have clear international domestic policy direction coming from the Global Biodiversity Framework that can inform management and disclosure frameworks like the TNFD that are applicable to companies across the world. And these then set the boundaries for disclosure standard development, like the 3 mentioned here. These standards can ultimately be taken up by regulations to give companies very clear instructions on what they need to disclose in order to fulfill the information needs of the market and their stakeholders. So for report preparers, the key takeaway is that policies and market regulations are on their way, if not already here. And in order to prepare for these and get ahead, it's important to start digging into these key resources, including the TNFD and the disclosure standards that may be relevant to you, and to start socializing these with your leaders and your organizations. So we hope that paints a decent picture for you, and I'll hand it over to MJ to take us into our panel discussion now.
Wonderful, David. Thank you so much. That is a great overview and a great table setting of some of the basic concepts that we need to keep in mind. So happy to dive in to the topic now and get some meat around the bones. I'm going to start with Zanetta. And if you could circle back on the biodiversity and nature and their interconnection with corporate strategy, corporate business models, and activities. How would you describe that? Give us some color around that.
Yes, so I did appreciate the definitions. Thank you, David, for that, because often when I speak, people kind of get confused about them. So what I could do, I could just give you that kind of beautiful example, what I call the business to biodiversity relationship, B2B, but not business to business, but business to biodiversity. And then briefly 2 examples of one very good management of biodiversity risk that is identified through dependency, and then one kind of unknown biodiversity risk to most of the industry players in aviation. So in terms of biodiversity nature, so I like to say, as David has put it, nature is everything. Biodiversity is the living part of it, the part that can renew. And together in beautiful forests and watersheds, they interact. And the way they interact is actually not really known to us people. We understand that there is interaction, but we actually don't understand individual parts of these interactions. But what we know that is that at the end of these interactions, something good comes, and that good is ecosystem services. That was the term that was also explained. So as biodiversity and nature interacts, at the end of that interaction, we get clean water. You know that if you are in the Canadian mountains up there, you can actually drink water from the stream because it's clean, and it's not clean by chlorination. It's clean thanks to ecosystem services. It's clean by nature for you. When we disturb these ecosystem services, these interactions in ecosystems by pollution, for example, that's when we have to step in and actually deliver the ecosystem service ourselves. And unfortunately, there is a lot of evidence out there suggesting that because we don't understand how nature delivers the ecosystem services, when we try to replicate them, we inevitably make mistakes. So there is a lot of scientific literature linking chlorination to certain diseases, for example. So I would just encourage the audience to have a look at those. In terms of the two examples I wanted to give you, one relates to water purification ecosystem service. So most cities around the world accomplish delivery and provision of safe drinking water to their populations by filtration and chlorination of the water that arrives to the city from rivers. New York City does it differently, and I think it's a fantastic example of management of ecosystem service, which is actually conducive to preservation of that ecosystem service. So New York City, since 1997, actually, so quite some time ago, has decided that it's going to protect its watershed instead of letting it get polluted and then addressing the problem by chlorination of the water. So New York City essentially works with different owners of different parts of that watershed because it's huge. It's 2,000 square miles, so the area of the state of Delaware. And that watershed provides 1.3 gallons of safe drinking water to 9 million people living in New York daily. So it's a huge undertaking there. And this is all undertaken by nature. And the way New York City does it is essentially they work with these landowners of different parts of the watershed, and they give them conservation easements over the watershed so that there is some sort of tax relief or other benefits that are designed to incentivize these landowners to make sure that when the water from their properties reaches the river or the streams that then feed into the river, the water is clean. So for example, if there is need for filtration, the filtration is usually very, it's not elaborate. It's not that kind of huge filtration you would find in filtration plants. It's very small, and it usually filters water from a single property that reaches the watershed. As a result of this, New York City actually does not have to go through a heavy process of filtration and chlorination because the water that reaches the city is relatively clean. And therefore, there are some numbers I can give you. They vary online. So I would say, don't quote me on that one, but I think there are good examples. So for example, one number I found is that to preserve the quality of water that New York City has now, they would have to pay 1.5 billion just to provide that service via filtration and chlorination plant. And that filtration plant of the capacity that the city needs would cost it approximately 6 billion to build and 250 million annually to maintain. So there is a lot of savings when you preserve the watershed for 1.5 billion. So that is the kind of success story I like to point people towards. It's the idea of the fact that nature for billions of years has been doing and preserving life on this planet on its own. It didn't need us. And only when we interfere negatively with it, then we have to step in and replace the ecosystem service of water purification by filtration and chlorination. But even that is imperfect. Even that's where we actually make mistakes. So the second example I want to give is that kind of dependency, which I think is largely unknown to the aviation industry. Aviation industry, I know when you look at an airplane, you would be like, where is the nature dependency? Well, the nature dependency is in the tires, in the undercarriage. Rubber that the tires of airplanes are made of is very special. It's called conductive rubber. The reason why it has to be special is because on landing and takeoff, airplanes are subjected to a lot of friction. And if it was the same rubber that is on our cars, that friction would develop and interfere with the electricity, potentially interfere with the electrical systems, and potentially result in the crash. So the rubber has to be very special to manage this friction. That conductive rubber comes from a single species of a tree, and that tree is native to the Amazon. Now, in the Amazon, because of the biodiversity, it cannot be grown monoculturally. The reason is because of the pests and parasites that exist. You know, monoculture tracks these pests and parasites. It's like a feast for them, and therefore the tree just cannot be grown there. So what we have done, we have transported this tree to a very similar climate in Southeast Asia, and that's where this tree is grown on monocultures agriculturally, which is great because we have a supply of this rubber to the aviation industry, but it also creates a huge risks because more than 90% of this rubber comes from this single region in Southeast Asia. And the research that I have read, the disclaimer is it's from 2011, so it's a bit old, but that was the only one I could find. So the research said that if these pests and parasites from the Amazon are transported to Southeast Asia, that plantations would be wiped out, the entire production would be wiped out in 10 years. So it's quite a dire prediction. And just to add, we know how fast viruses can travel around the world thanks to COVID-19. So that's also a cautionary tale there.
Yeah, thank you for that. These are great examples, and examples really do help bring the issues home. And it makes me realize also that there's tremendous amount of research that has to go into companies, businesses, organizations, states, governments, municipalities, understanding what their connection is to biodiversity. We take it for granted because we're not even aware that it exists, and you have to go down many levels to understand the sources. So lots of work ahead of us. Turning to Gabriella, feel free, by the way, Gabriella, to bounce off of some of the things that Zanetta has mentioned. And if you could also, continuing on the path of, you know, the connection with corporate business or strategy and corporate entities, speak to us about the why. Why are we talking about biodiversity loss? Why does it matter? And why ultimately is this something important for companies? We've touched about it now on one or two occasions, but would love your take on that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, MJ, and hello, everybody. And thank you very much for the invitation as well. So maybe to give just a little bit of color into the context of UNEP-FI and that I'm representing here, as it may not be known to the public. So UNEP-FI is a partnership between the UN Environment Program and the private financial sector. And it's bringing now together more than 500 financial institutions worldwide, trying to understand and tackle all these different challenges that we're facing right now. And UNEP-FI really tries to catalyze the integration of sustainability into financial market practices, trying to understand what we call the triple nature crisis in the United Nations. So it's remembering that we're not only talking about, as we've already touched upon here, not only about climate change, but also we need to think about the biodiversity crisis that we're currently facing and the pollution crisis that's also all sitting together and facing the same challenge. So, and that's also very importantly to just bring this point here that David touched upon very briefly, that just transition is also about that. It's about tackling all these challenges together, right? With consideration to affected indigenous peoples and local communities. So talking about the biodiversity crisis, indeed, we're now understanding more and more, you know, we're able to measure in numbers what it means. So David already brought this, but let me highlight it once again. This study that was quite groundbreaking that showed that more than half of the global economic output, which means 44 trillion US dollars, is dependent to some extent on nature. So that really makes us understand in numbers how much our economic output is really dependent on nature. And we might not know. The examples that Zanetta brought us here just before make us understand, right? All these ecosystem services that are provided for free to us. And then also, I think for now, the past 5 years in a row, the loss of biodiversity has also been identified by the this also very important publication that comes out every year, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, mentioning that biodiversity loss is among the top 5 risks by impact to the global economy. So the loss of biodiversity could have, once again, economic and financial implications, heavily impacting the worldwide supply chains and raw materials that underpin all the productivity worldwide. So, and also, I mean, the IBAS as well, as mentioned by David, is another very important report from 2019 that showed us that an estimated 1 million species are currently under risk of extinction, and most of them in the near future. So worldwide, animal populations, they have experienced an average decline. I mean, that's a very staggering number, but it's important for us to keep it in mind. So an average decline recently of almost 70% of animal populations since 1970. So that number was recently brought to us by the Living Planet Index from WWF. And it also makes us understand that from all the biomass that we have today, which means 90% of those are humans and livestock, and only 4% are wild mammals. And while we have, and we often think of those more charismatic species, such as the panda or the polar bear, this biodiversity loss that we're experiencing and the animal population decline that we're experiencing also includes those lesser known organisms that contribute to all those ecosystem services to be working correspondingly. So they contribute to keeping our soil health, the water purification, carbon sequestration, right? So the linkage to climate change as well, and all these other essential services. And for humans, the erosion of diversity and gene, species, habitat, and the interactions between them means that we are at risk of cascading, unraveling of our economies and life support systems, which is both accelerating and accelerated by global economies, by global climate change. So yeah, ultimately, this is why this also means so much for businesses and financial institutions. And there's just final point is this sentence that I really, really like that came from, well, this also groundbreaking study called the Dasgupta Review that also made us understand all this context of why nature and business are interconnected and why biodiversity loss mean so much for businesses. It says that, well, biodiversity actually has 3 pervasive features that are so important: mobility, silence, and invisibility. And that's why it makes it impossible for markets to adequately record the use that we make of nature's goods and services. So I think that we're now at a good place in understanding and making the right linkages to why businesses really should care. And it's really, we're in a positive place, I think, right now, as we have these increased expectations for biodiversity related data disclosure. And the field is really maturing in the coming years, as we saw with all the coming standards and frameworks that are coming out, all the regulatory disclosures that are also being put in place right now. So this is all coming to a place where we're starting to tackle the biodiversity crisis. And ultimately, I think the approval of the global biodiversity framework that happened in Canada, actually, where I think some of us are speaking from right now, was a great guiding star as well to put the whole world more aligned and on track to tackling the biodiversity challenge.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gabriella. And I think if there's one word that we need to impress in our minds is interconnection. Everything is interconnected. We are interconnected to biodiversity. And the reason why these species are also important is for all the things that they do to enable us to live on this planet. And we talk a lot about, the corporate dimension and the need for corporates to understand the importance of this issue and the global financial sector as well. But there's also the need for us as individuals to take this issue very seriously. And you touched on the whole, just transition, or the just, measures to address these systemic issues that are also interconnected: climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution. Also you can add, wealth inequality in there. And that leads me to my next question, which is on the connection that we can make, or the comparison that we can make between climate and biodiversity loss. So the question is to both of you. I'll turn it back to Zanetta to get us started. But how do they compare? What can we learn from having started, at least, to tackle climate change? We're far from having, achieved success, but what can we learn from having started to tackle change to tackling biodiversity loss?
Yes. Okay. So I can highlight two differences, and then I can pass over to Gabriela for any other additional ones. So one of them, which is really important to law, I'm a lawyer, so that is where I usually come from. So it's localized nature of biodiversity loss. So biodiversity loss is always location specific. It happens on the ground, it happens in the ocean, on the land, but it happens in certain geographical area. It's very, very different from climate change, because while the cause of climate change would be localized, or the source of the greenhouse gas emissions, which then cause the warming of the climate and then impacts, they're localized. They would be different fabrics and factories and you name it. But when they go to the atmosphere, they accumulate, they mix up. And then that accumulation of greenhouse gases, as we know, causes the warming effect. And then the impact is again felt locally. But that process goes through this global aspect, which is the accumulation. And that is very different from biodiversity loss, which is always localized. It wouldn't be globalized. And there is, subject to certain elaborations I will not go into, there is a difference or there is a proximity in terms of the costs of the pollution, let's say, if the biodiversity loss is caused by pollution, and then the impact of that pollution. So that's the first, the localized and globalized nature of biodiversity loss on one hand, and climate change on the other, is a huge difference, and it has huge legal repercussions. The second difference would be, biodiversity loss is more complex in terms of measuring and understanding. And often when I talk to scientists, they tell me we have all the science we need. So I want to emphasize that because it's more complex, it doesn't mean it's something that we should not address. Every time I say it's more complex, scientists are like, well, it is, but we have the science, so that shouldn't be a disguise for inaction. So in terms of climate change, we measure it in greenhouse gases or CO2 equivalent so that we have a number. It's easy. Our brains are like, oh, this is easy to understand. Biodiversity loss is a bit different. So first of all, it will be always location specific. So depending on the ecosystem or biome in which you are, you will measure loss of different species. You will measure impact on different species. So you have to understand the location specific nature of your impacts and dependencies. Biodiversity loss is also driven by different factors. So climate change is driven by emission of greenhouse gases. Biodiversity loss is driven by 5 different factors, 2 of which are climate change and pollution. So this is the interconnection there. Climate change is driving biodiversity loss. Pollution is driving biodiversity loss, and there are 3 more. I just don't want to kind of make it too complex. But I think this is also important to understand, because what it tells you is, first of all, that through addressing climate change, addressing pollution and those other drivers, you can address biodiversity loss, but also that biodiversity loss and the frameworks that we are developing on biodiversity disclosures, nature-related disclosures, and measurements can actually subsume the other reporting frameworks. And this is also what I have heard from a lot of market analysts who tell me that once TNFD recommendations are published, they will subsume TCFD. There will be no separate climate reporting. It will all be under TNFD, which in my understanding of biodiversity loss is absolutely possible. The same for pollution. So I think we need to understand that everything links to nature, that the interconnection is really all kind of, as we say, all roads lead to Rome. Everything leads to nature and biodiversity. And through addressing the causes, we do address the biodiversity, but we also have to look at biodiversity as such.
Super interesting. Lots of nuggets there. I'm going to circle back on them in a sec. But Gabriela, what would you have to complement or to say in terms of the similarities and what we can learn from climate to tackle biodiversity loss.
Right, thank you, MJ. I think I'll just, Zanetta already made a great introduction to the topic. So maybe I can just bring some examples, very practical, from an exercise that we conducted at UNEP-FI that was very invaluable, I think. So we have been conducting for more than a year now pilots to the TNFD beta framework. So I think that the public might be aware that the TNFD has proposed an iterative process to producing the TNFD beta frameworks, in which it released beta frameworks, received feedback, and so on. And so at UNEP-FI, we proposed to global financial institutions to test the beta frameworks and see how feasible it would be and what were key gaps and main challenges that they faced. And we looked into the main high impact sectors related to nature, and also priority locations with potential risk of biodiversity loss. And one of those sectors that we analyzed was quite interesting, was the one of offshore wind farms, which is considered, well, a key sector for energy transition, right? So to help tackle climate change and all its consequences. And one of the main findings that we saw was exactly on the climate nature nexus. And that was quite surprising to most of those financial institutions that were with us conducting this exercise. So also for a bit of context, we brought together more than 40 financial institutions from more than 20 countries. It was quite a global exercise. And those financial institutions that were assessing their portfolios in offshore wind farms, they discovered that, well, although they had done a good due diligence process and that the areas that they had chosen were quite positive, contributing to tackle climate change, they don't necessarily, that didn't apply necessarily to biodiversity. And they did identify then some negative impacts that those offshore wind farms had to the local biodiversity, such as for bird species or seabed habitats that they had not considered before. So that shows us how everything is indeed linked, and we're not necessarily considering and collecting the needed information. I think that's really the key point here that we saw with this exercise really in practice. But when it comes, to simplifying a bit the picture of what's happening on corporate reporting, is that the information that you will start collecting will get a bit more granular, because as Aneta let us know, we need location-specific information that's key for understanding, right, nature-related risks. But that will also help inform how you are tackling your climate change risks and so on. So everything, the whole picture is linked. It's just that we need more information for more granular reporting, right? So I think this consistency and alignment towards where we're headed in the reporting picture in the coming years, as mentioned by the TNF before by David, the TNFD is already having those discussions, right, with its knowledge partners. All of those different standards which are coming out are trying to go into the same direction. So it is, it's a good place to start, I think, and we're headed, I hope, towards more information, more disclosures that will help us better understand and tackle these risks.
Yeah, thanks for that. I completely agree on the disclosure front, and what we learned from climate that we're applying to biodiversity is much quicker convergence. This global, I call it a global framework with the TNFD, that all the other standards are now aligning to, and hopefully will bake in. So we have much quicker alignment on what we need to be measuring, collecting, managing. I hear you on the more granular information. I would tend to say it'll be a lot more granular, not a little more granular. We have a couple of questions actually on the issue of disclosures that I want to get to in a sec. I just want to underline, Zanetta, the two things that you said that I think is a shift in people's understanding. And one is, yeah, it's more complex, but we have the science. So it's not because it's more complex that we can't address it. And I think a lot of people might use the complexity as a reason or an excuse to, like, oh, we can't do this. I think that's a really important message to bring across.
MJ, sorry, if I may just comment quickly
for sure.
on this. I think that also on this piloting exercise we conducted, most of the financial institutions, which are definitely, connected to their corporate clients, many of them were a bit lost when they were first starting, their assessment. But after we finalized this exercise, after over a bit 6 months, they realized that they had much more at hand than they believed in the beginning, right? So I think a lot about understanding the data that you have at hand is about where, first of all, seeing what you have and you may not know that's useful for biodiversity disclosure, for instance, reporting. And we also learned a quick win that we saw from this exercise was that most of those who were already working on their TCFD reporting, for instance, had a great place to start. And then it was just about connecting the dots and the data that they had, and sometimes they didn't even know that they had at hand.
Yeah, completely agree. And the whole concept of nature-based reporting superseding and encompassing the climate-based disclosures, and that you wouldn't have separate climate disclosures. I think that's a new one for people to wrap their heads around. So, but interesting to have that future vision. So going to some of the questions we've got. So we have a question from Bonnie. It's it's relatively long. I'm going to read it out to you so you can start thinking about your different elements of response. I'll also caveat by saying I think this is the beginning of a conversation. We won't hope to give complete answers or draw a complete picture of this very, very complex and rich topic. So we will continue the conversation over time, and we're all in this learning process together. So Bonnie's question is, my company measures the data required to assess sustainability and biodiversity for agricultural ecosystems in Canada, the US, Australia, and we have data for over 2 million acres. I've been tasked with telling the biodiversity story from our producers, as well as provide market-based mechanisms for our producers to make changes towards practices that enhance biodiversity. What does the panel see as the future for biodiversity reporting coming out of the agricultural industry? There is currently no standardized reporting methodology that captures the full spectrum of ecosystem services from large-scale agriculture that provides the right motivators for farmers. What does the panel think of reporting in the form of environmental financial statements? Yeah, two sets of questions there. So what are what's the future of reporting specific to the agriculture and large agricultural organizations on biodiversity and in a way to motivate your value chain, right? The farmers. So I'm paraphrasing a bit. Who would like to start?
So I can address very briefly just the point I can. As you know, I don't work in reporting or measuring as a lawyer. But one thing in terms of how to work with, I would say, people up and down your supply chain, because I do that a lot with my clients where they adopt, nature positive goal or net zero goal, but it includes their supply chains. So the way I have seen that is probably the only effective way is collaboration and knowledge transfer. So especially in agriculture, I know that a lot of people at the beginning of the supply chain are actually small scale farmers. So you can't expect them to be able to measure, to send them a document and they just fill out the form for you. There has to be that knowledge transfer to them, which comes to collaboration. And the way I have been doing it, and my colleagues have been doing it, it's true. For example, when the net zero targets, we would organize like a conference with suppliers of our client, and then we would explain everything to these suppliers. And then we would say, like, you have to do the same with your suppliers. You can't dump net zero target on them. That's not how you do it. That's how you lose your business relationships. And I think that's what I can share to the extent that I can understand the industry, is that there needs to be the collaboration. There needs to be the knowledge transfer. You cannot just, as a big corporation at the top of the supply chain, you just cannot dump everything down, because you will just lose the relationships, or there'll be a lot of, greenwashing, because those people will not know what to do, but they eventually need, the resources to sustain themselves. So they will essentially lie. And I think that's what you need to avoid, because at the end of the day, the greenwashing will be on your shoulders.
Yeah, we're going to get back to the greenwashing because I do have a follow-up question on you on that for you later on. I hear what you're saying. I think the need to engage and educate your value chain and farmers are suppliers to agricultural producers And we've seen it for climate, where there's, education programs and companies taking this into their own hands because there isn't really anything in the market to mobilize these people on a global scale. So, by the way, David, feel free to jump in with some elements of response if you'd like. Gabriella, I don't know if you have anything specific that you want to share with respect to Bonnie's question.
Right. I think just complementing, on Danetta's point, which I think is really key. And that was exactly the point I wanted to raise here. We're now having this conversation in which we're finally, bringing all the actors together. That was also one of the key findings that we had from our piloting work, was that although we were only working with the financial sector and they were assessing their agriculture portfolio, for instance, they saw how they needed to have a strengthened stakeholder engagement dialogue. They need to be talking to their corporate clients. They also, those that had more of a smallholder farmers in their portfolio, they saw how they would need to bring this capacity building component. So it's about, bringing all the actors together, strengthening capacity building. There's really this need to better understand, right, what we were talking in the beginning about the interconnectedness, as this will only benefit all the market actors, really. So, and also bringing this consistency and alignment. So it's really a chain of, improving the whole of the system with the disclosures that corporates, financial institutions will be making. They will then identify gaps in capacity building, have better dialogue with the end producers, and so on. It's really a chain that benefits everybody in the end. Yeah.
David, do you want to add something?
No, nothing major to add on this topic, but there are, I think there are two interesting related questions that.
Yeah, I see them when we're gonna spend the rest of our time on the questions. I would add to Bonnie. So first of all, no hard, fast answer for you. However, I would say right now the frameworks and standards, TNFD, and some of the other standards that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, are focusing on the topic of biodiversity. I think you're going to start seeing them after develop industry-specific standards. So GRI has sector-specific standards. In fact, agriculture may be in the works right now or coming up soon. The IFRS wants to develop sector-specific standard. ESRS in Europe want to develop sector. So I think you're going to start to see more granular sector-specific guidance and requirements coming over time. I think it's just very, very early days. Another couple of questions on another industry, the forestry industry. I'm going to link the two questions. I don't know if they're from the same person, but how do some industries like forestry align on these frameworks when they impact nature by their very existence? So, should we be doing away with the forestry industry, or how can the forestry industry be sustainable and ideally regenerative? And the other on forestry is, could a nature-friendly forestry industry exist, or would the frameworks lead to the disappearance of this industry? So same for some types of fishing industries. So who would like to start on that one?
I have 2 points only, so I can start and get them out of the way. So I think it can, and I would encourage the author of the question to look at the tipping points, because what we know is that nature has a natural capacity to regenerate, right? It's the same as our bodies. We have immune systems, so we are attacked by viruses, and you can actually heal from an illness without any antibiotics. That's just what we do because we don't have time to heal. But normally, every single natural organism has a capacity to heal, and nature does as well. And what we know from science is that we are overshooting this capacity. There is a term called overshoot days, and each country in the world has a different overshoot day. It's a day in the year beyond which we are using natural resources beyond natural capacity of the ecosystem to restore them. So forestry can exist if you don't overshoot, right? If you actually harvest only what nature can replace naturally. And those are all the concepts that you can explore, because in nature, trees die naturally, right? There is that regenerative process. So if you take them out, the nature can restore them. It's just that we have been for centuries overshooting those thresholds. Those are the tipping points that we have, overshoot. Another thing I want to share with you, this is not related to forestry industry, but ecosystems as such. Ecosystems have developed to depend on other animals to graze them, for example. So this is the law of dependence that MJ has also mentioned. So for example, I'll go to Canada. Canadian prairies, they are adapted to being grazed. If they are not being grazed, they deteriorate. When you go to Canadian prairies, the Grassland National Park, the Canadian side is very lively. It's full of the species it should be because it's being grazed by cattle. So it's not, there are some bison reintroduced, but it's actually cattle that is grazing the prairies. The US side that you can see across the border is completely desolate. It's not very healthy, and it's because they prohibited grazing. But the ecosystem needs to be grazed. So what I would suggest as well, and again, I'm not a scientist, but I just observe things as I travel. This is really important. You can produce beef if you produce it in the ecosystem which needs to be grazed, which are the prairies. And the same with forestry, like go to the ecosystem which needs the trees to be cut. I don't know which that ecosystem is, but there would be an ecosystem that requires reduction of tree density every now and then. So you can work with the ecosystem because ecosystems do depend on the species like bison, and that capacity of the species to preserve the ecosystem can be replaced by something we need like cattle. Again, to the tipping point, right? Because we can't take over the ecosystem and damage it again, which we have been doing.
In the interest of time, I'm going to direct the next question to you, Gabriela. And thank you for that, by the way, Zanetta. I mean, I think there's so much that we need to unpack and learn. There's not going to be any easy answers, no easy questions, no easy answers. All great questions, by the way. Question that you can help to address, Gabriela. So from Suzanne. Hi, Suzanne. How can we effectively communicate and teach the concept of systems and interrelatedness to the general public, considering that it's human nature to break down concepts into smaller components and address them separately? Are there any strategies or innovative approaches that can help bridge this comprehension gap and foster a holistic understanding of ecosystems? Wondering if the TNFD has done any work, and how are we going to convey all this to people so they understand it?
Right, thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. Indeed, I can speak a bit to that, as UNEP-FI is one of the founding partners to the TNFD. So I think the TNFD has really done a great job so far in bringing together, I think, everything that was pretty much out there and trying to bring this consistency and alignment and try to bring this understanding internally. Most of the corporates and the financial institutions we've spoken to have highlighted this challenge to us, that they have a real challenge in conveying the story and getting buy-in internally. But I think that as the TNFD will now come with its final recommendations in September, and it's important to also highlight that the recommendations, I think in the beginning, we had two core elements, which were the disclosures themselves, and then the LEAP, which is called the LEAP framework, which I invite everyone to have a look into, which is really the risk management framework. And important to also mention here that LEAP does want you to, in the end, assess your risks, your impacts, but also what can be the opportunities that you can have, right? When investing in nature-based solutions, for instance, when thinking of green financial products, as we saw with financial institutions. So it's not about only thinking of impacts and risks, but the double materiality really approach. And so with these two core elements, they realized the need to also bring many other elements together. So for instance, sector guidance came into the radar of the TNFD. So they are thinking of developing that. For agriculture, for example, they have developed already metrics for the agriculture sector, and thinking of all the other most high impact and high dependency sectors. They are thinking of developing materials, but they realize, right, how much there is this need for so much guidance and bringing together everything that was out there so that the market can have more understanding and we can move forward faster, as that is also the objective. So of, bringing together all the pieces, all the target setting, the transition plans that your company is doing, how all of that can fit together and be important for the disclosures of the TNFD, for example.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I'm actually going to close us off by connecting that question and some of the responses to the last question, because I think Suzanne's question about how do we get people to understand is really mindset shift. How do you get people to shift their mindset to an interconnected, interbeing concept and our relationship as humans within nature, which is, going back to that. We had that before. centuries ago. We need to go back to that. And Antonio's question of how do you believe Indigenous communities could be involved with minimizing the risk of biodiversity loss through these financial measures? I think Indigenous communities have that mindset. They can teach us this mindset and shifting our way of thinking about things and how we look at issues, how we seek to address and bring solutions to issues. So just a quick, 5-second thought on that, the Indigenous communities, what they can teach us or how they can contribute to minimizing biodiversity loss. And then we're gonna close it off. We're already over time.
I'm really happy about this question, and I will combine it with Suzanne's question, which is, how do we communicate? What I've learned from Indigenous people is circularity. We think linearly, right? Like we are like, oh, framework. Whereas if you make a circle, it doesn't have an end or a beginning, it's a circle. And there are so many fantastic frameworks of Indigenous thinking that present nature in a circle. And one which is Westernized, which is quite interesting, is the planetary boundaries framework. So you can start with the West till you can work your way towards the Indigenous thinking. But I cannot agree more, MJ. Like, yes. The teachers.
Circle and wholeness and infinity. Gabriella?
Exactly.
Yeah, a quick point on this one, as it's so important, is about how we're now understanding that Indigenous communities have to be part of the conversation, just as everyone else, right? They don't have to be only involved at the very end of your risk management framework, but really since the onset of your project, they have to be part of the whole conversation because they have so much to teach us, as Aneta was mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great way to end a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you so much to both of you. Fascinating. We should do this on a regular basis as we're all generally together progressing in our understanding. Thank you, David, for setting the table and really clear understanding of the basic concepts we need to have in mind. And thanks everybody for attending. We will have a recording of the webinar and copies of the slides available for you in the next day or so. And looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Maybe in the next one, we could have an Indigenous person coming.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.